Welcome to the Deep Dive, your express route to understanding complex systems without drowning in the details.
Hello.
Today, we're jumping into a fundamental anatomical deep dive on the human upper limb, and our guide is, of course, the incredible detail in Gray's Anatomy.
And we're not just looking at an arm.
No, not at all. We're dissecting this masterful piece of engineering. It's a highly specialized, powered, articulated structure with really just one main purpose.
To position the hand. That's the whole game. The hand is our ultimate tool for sensing and for manipulating the world.
And that mission, positioning the hand, is really the framework for our whole discussion today, isn't it?
It is. Our challenge is to take all these complex diagrams from Gray's, the pectoral girdle, the upper limb, all those 3D relationships, and turn them into something you can actually picture in your mind.
A clear, audible map.
Exactly. And the whole narrative, the thread that runs through every bone, every muscle, is this constant trade-off between achieving maximum mobility and somehow maintaining enough stability.
That mobility challenge immediately makes me think the sensory system. I mean, it's so much more complex than just receptors in the skin.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a great little nugget in the source material to kick us off. Think about recognizing an object blindfolded.
Like finding your keys in your pocket.
Exactly. That process, it's called stereognosis, is actually impossible without movement. You can't just touch it.
Right. It's the dynamic input that matters. You're getting information from the skin, sure, but also from your tendons, your muscles, the joints themselves.
So it's the movement itself that generates the data.
It is. The constant subtle movement creates these spatial and temporal patterns that your brain then uses to identify the object. The sensory-motor cortex isn't just a controller, it's actively regulating movement to get that sensory data.
That is the functional core of the upper limb right there.
That combination, yes.
Okay, so let's unpack the structure that makes all of this possible, starting with the scaffolding, the bones.
We can start with the pectoral girdle. So that's the flat, powerful scapula, your shoulder blade, and the strut-like clavicle, your collarbone.
And from there, we move out into the free limb.
Right. The humerus in the arm, and then the paired radius and ulna in the forearm. And those two are linked for their entire length by this really key stabilizing sheet, the interosseous membrane.
And then we get to the hand.
The complex architecture of the hand. You have 8 small carpal bones at the wrist, 5 metacarpals in the palm, and then 14 phalanges.
That's 2 in the thumb and 3 in each of the other fingers.
Exactly.
So let's talk joints, because this is where that whole mobility versus stability conflict really comes into focus.
It really is. The entire upper limb, the whole thing, relies on one single bony connection to your axial skeleton, your ribs and spine.
Just one. Which one is it?
The sternoclavicular joint, where your collarbone meets your breastbone. Everything else is basically floating, held in place by muscle and ligament.
Wow. That seems incredibly vulnerable.
It is the vulnerability. And the main engine, the glenohumeral or shoulder joint, is intentionally shallow. It's like a golf ball on a tee, which allows for that incredible range of motion.
So it relies almost entirely on soft tissue for stability.
It does. But functionally, the most crucial joint isn't even that one. It's what we call the thoracoscapular joint.
The interface between the scapula and the chest wall.
Yes. And why is that so critical?
Yeah.
Because it is the stable platform that all arm movement starts from.
Okay, I see.
The text really stresses this. If the key stabilizing muscles there, like the trapezius or serratus anterior, are paralyzed, it's crippling.
Because you can't fix the scapula against the chest wall.
Right. You lose the ability to lift your arm because the base itself is unstable.
So let's try to quantify some of that freedom of movement, help visualize the mechanics.
Okay, start at the elbow. It's a simple hinge, more or less, about 150 degrees of flexion and extension.
Pretty straightforward.
But the real magic is in the forearm. It gives you roughly 180 degrees of what we call supination.
And that's turning your palm up and down.
Exactly. Palm up is supination, palm down is pronation. And that range is pretty much unique to primates.
And the wrist.
At the wrist, we get about 140 degrees of flexion and extension and another 70 degrees of side-to-side movement. Then you get down to your knuckles, the metacarpal joints, and they offer a huge range too.
About 120 degrees of flexion and 40 degrees of spread.
Plus some rotation for gripping. It's a kinematic masterpiece.
Moving from the hard structure to the soft layers, let's talk skin and fascia, the body's wrapping. There's a pretty big contrast here.
There is. You have the thicker, hairy postaxial skin that covers the back of your neck, shoulder, and arm. It's designed for minor protection.
And you contrast that with the preaxial skin on the front.
Which is much thinner and more mobile.
But the hand just flips that whole script.
It does. The palmar skin is specialized. It's extremely thick, and it's secured very tightly by a fibrous skeleton underneath it.
To resist shear forces when we grip things.
Precisely. It forms our grip lines. Meanwhile, the skin on the back of the hand, the dorsal side, is thin and super mobile, letting your fingers curl and spread without any restriction.
This is where we get to that internal machinery, the deep fascia, and the whole concept of compartments. This tight organization is really the aha moment for me.
Yes, the deep fascia, these things called intermuscular septa and that interosseous membrane we mentioned, they all form this internal girdle. They create discrete, non-expansive compartments.
And this helps muscles glide efficiently.
Yes, and provides broad areas for them to attach. But clinically, this efficiency becomes a huge vulnerability.
Right. You're talking about compartment syndrome, so explain why this tight, organized structure is suddenly so dangerous.
Well, imagine a pressure cooker. When you have trauma or an infection that causes bleeding or swelling inside one of these tight compartments, that volume has nowhere to go.
Okay.
So the pressure inside the compartment, the intracompartmental pressure, skyrockets.
And it acts like a tourniquet from the inside.
Exactly. And it collapses the low-pressure systems first, so your veins and your lymphatics.
And once that venous outflow is blocked.
Arterial inflow can't get in.
Yeah.
Even though it's higher pressure, it can't overcome that rapidly rising external pressure. Blood flow stops. You get critical ischemia.
Tissue death.
Tissue death. The very fascia that's designed for efficiency suddenly traps the tissue and cuts off its own lifeline.
It's a terrifying mechanical consequence. So to visualize the pathways of all the neurovascular supply, we need to picture the sheaths they travel in.
Right, the fascial wrapping. It starts up in the neck with the prevertebral fascia, which extends down into the shoulder area and forms the axillary sheath.
And this sheath is critical.
It is. It envelops the brachial plexus cords and the axillary artery. Then it just continues down the arm as the brachial sheath, wrapping everything tightly.
And what's remarkable is that the nerves inside these sheaths aren't static, are they? They're built for motion.
Absolutely. Graves notes that the main nerves of the upper limb are designed to move. They have an excursion range of 10 to 15 millimeters across fixed points, like the first rib.
So they glide.
They have to glide to prevent the nerve fibers from being overstretched and damaged during all the massive movements the limb performs.
Okay, now for the engines. The muscles. We can group them by where they anchor.
We can. For the shoulder, there are three primary groups. First are the stabilizers. They go from the axial skeleton to the scapula.
That's your trapezius, levator scapulae, the rhomboids.
And the serratus anterior. Second, you have the heavy proximal movers like pectoralis major and latissimus dorsi. They go from the axial skeleton straight to the humerus.
And the third group is the one that really fine-tunes shoulder movement.
Right, the ones that go from the scapula to the humerus, that's your rotator cuff supra, and infraspinatus, subscapularis, teres minor, along with a massive deltoid muscle.
The beauty, though, is in the muscles that cross multiple joints.
They create so much synergistic power.
We all think of the biceps as an elbow flexor, but the key insight here is that it's a much more powerful supinator.
A far more powerful supinator, yes. Turning the palm up, especially when the elbow is bent, that combination is a powerhouse move.
And here's a fact from the text that really surprised me. The flexor carpi ulnaris is noted as the most powerful muscle in the entire forearm.
It does surprise a lot of people.
So why that specific wrist muscle? I mean, why not one of the big ones that controls all the fingers?
It's all about mechanical advantage. It originates way up high, it crosses the elbow joint, and it inserts way down on the carpal bones. This gives it huge leverage for both wrist flexion and adduction.
So it's a major workhorse for stabilizing the wrist during a power grip.
A critical workhorse, yes.
We also see functional specialization inside a single muscle, like the deltoid.
Correct. The anterior fibers of the deltoid are a powerful flexor of the shoulder, lifting your arm forward.
While the posterior fibers do the exact opposite.
They're the most powerful extensors, drawing the arm backward. One muscle, with basically antagonistic parts.
And when this complex synergy breaks down, you can see it very clearly.
Oh, yes. The pathology tells the story. If those small intrinsic hand muscles are paralyzed, you get that classic clawing deformity.
And if the thumb's balance is lost.
You see the thumb in palm posture because the flexor pollicis longus is just completely unopposed.
The injury reveals the lost balance. Okay, let's transition to the supply lines and track the main arterial trunk.
It starts high in the neck as the subclavian artery, which is divided into three parts. based on its relationship to the scalenus anterior muscle.
Then that subclavian passes the first rib and becomes the axillary artery.
And crucially, the parts of the axillary artery are mapped very closely to the cords of the brachial plexus.
Okay, and then it becomes the brachial artery at the lower edge of the teres major muscle.
Right. And the brachial artery runs down the arm, often traveling very close to the median nerve. Then just below the elbow, it splits,
Into the radial and ulnar arteries?
with the ulnar almost always being the larger of the two branches.
Now, the resilience of the limb really depends on something called collateral circulation, right? This is where the anatomical overlap protects us.
This is a huge functional advantage over the lower limb. The upper limb has this extensive network of anastomosis connections between arteries, especially around the shoulder.
So if the main pipeline gets blocked,
If the main subclavian artery is occluded, the limb has a really good chance of survival because of this robust collateral network.
let's locate some of these vessels for the listener. Where are the key spots to feel for a pulse?
Okay, the subclavian can be felt against the first rib, just to the side of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Pressing there is the best way to control bleeding from deep in the axilla without surgery.
And the brachial artery.
That's in the medial groove of the arm. You can feel it in the valley between your biceps and triceps. And of course, the radial and ulnar pulses are found near the wrist.
For venous return, the superficial system is the one we see.
We have two main superficial veins. The cephalic vein drains the radial or thumb side. It runs up the outside of the arm and eventually dives deep to join the axillary vein.
And the basilic vein is on the other side.
Right, the ulnar side. It runs up the inside, the medial side, and it dives deep right at the elbow to join the deep veins and form the axillary vein.
And the most important one clinically is the bridge between them.
The median cubital vein. It crosses the cubital fossa, the pit of your elbow, connecting the cephalic and basilic. Its stability and size make it the go-to spot for drawing blood.
Got it. Okay, finally, the neurocontrol system, the brachial plexus. This thing is complex. It needs some careful visualization.
It does. Imagine a massive electrical cable coming from the C5 down to the T1 nerve roots in your neck. It splits and rejoins 3 times.
Yeah, we go from roots to trunks.
C5, T1 are the roots. They merge into 3 trunks, upper, middle, and lower.
Then those trunks split into divisions.
6 divisions. 3 go forward, the anterior ones, and 3 go backward, the posterior ones. And here's the key functional split.
This is the important part.
All the posterior divisions group together to form the posterior cord, which supplies all the extensor muscles.
Back half for extension.
And the anterior divisions form the lateral and medial cords, which supply all the flexors.
Front half for flexion. That simplifies it nicely. Now, we have to mention the nerves that handle that proximal scapular stabilization.
Like the long thoracic nerve, which is a major one. It controls the serratus anterior.
And it's known for being vulnerable.
Right. It has this long, winding course deep to the muscle. Its length makes it susceptible to injury, which results in that debilitating winging of the scapula.
Moving to the big terminal branches, the radial nerve is the largest, branching off that posterior cord, and it famously runs in the spiral groove of the humerus.
Yep. Then you have the median nerve, formed by pieces from both the lateral and medial cords. It meets up in front of the axillary artery and runs down the arm right next to the brachial artery.
And it's heading for the precision muscles of the hand.
Exactly. And finally, the ulnar nerve.
The continuation of the medial cord.
Yes, and it's infamous for one thing. It passes behind the medial epicondyle.
The funny bone.
That's the one. That tight space is the cubital tunnel. Hitting it sends that shock down your arm because you're compressing the ulnar nerve directly against the bone.
We mentioned segmental control earlier. C5 for shoulder abduction, C7 is widespread.
And C8 and T1 are really specialized for those small intrinsic hand muscles, critical for fine motor control.
And for sensation, the C7 dermatome supplies the central part of the hand and the middle finger.
Defining that central axis of sensation for the whole limb.
Okay, let's wrap this amazing overview by focusing on the high-stakes clinical locations and what we can actually feel.
For any physical exam, palpation is key. You have to be able to find the olecranon triangle at the elbow.
The relationship between the bony point of the elbow and the 2 bumps on either side.
Yes, the olecranon and the epicondyles. That alignment has to be perfect, whether the arm is bent or straight. It's a fast check for joint stability.
And down at the wrist.
You need to feel the boundaries of the carpal tunnel. Medially, the pisiform and the hook of the hamate. Laterally, the tubercles of the scaphoid and trapezium. It's like a horseshoe of bone at the base of the tunnel.
And we can't forget the anatomical snuff box.
Never. That little depression on the back of your wrist, you can feel the radial artery pulse deep inside it.
Now let's talk vulnerability. Why do certain nerves seem to break so often? You mentioned it's about tethering.
It is. When a nerve is anchored in place, say by fascia, any trauma can cause it to stretch or shear sharply over a fixed point, like a bone.
The axillary nerve is a classic example.
Absolutely. It's tethered as it passes through the quadrilateral tunnel, making it highly vulnerable during an anterior shoulder dislocation.
And the radial nerve is at risk with humeral fractures.
For the same reason, it's fixed where it pierces the intermuscular septa, crossing from the back to the front of the arm. A fracture right there is bad news for the nerve.
We talked about critical ischemia earlier, but what are the cardinal signs a clinician needs to spot?
Number one is severe pain, out of proportion. Then a rapid loss of duct sensation. But importantly, the warm and dry skin sign.
Warm and dry, that seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it indicates sympathetic paralysis. The small vessels are wide open and the sweat glands have stopped working. The nerve supply is gone. It's a key, urgent sign of compromise.
Finally, let's touch on compression way up high thoracic outlet syndromes, or TOS.
These are compressions near the base of the neck. Arterial TOS is compression of the subclavian artery, often by an extracervical rib, and it doesn't just block flow.
What else does it do?
The artery often dilates or even forms an aneurysm just distal to the compression, which risks throwing small clots down the arm.
And true neurogenic TOS.
Much rarer. It presents with subtle chronic nerve damage, leading to muscle wasting, especially in the small muscles of the hand.
So what we've really explored today is this system that is just defined by its capacity for extreme movement and its necessary structural resilience.
From the bony foundation and the compartmentalization to the vascular supply and its collateral insurance, and the sheer complexity of the brachial plexus.
It's a structure designed not just for use,
but for continuous, tireless recovery.
And that resilience brings us to our final thought. When a nerve is injured, sometimes tapping along its course will elicit this sharp, radiating pins and needles sensation.
Tenal sign.
Tenal sign, and it's painful, but clinically, it's this profoundly useful indicator. What does it tell us?
It confirms that axons have ruptured and are actively, desperately attempting to regenerate down that nerve sheath.
So that feeling, that pain, is actually a sign of life.
It's a sign of the attempt to repair. That palpable, continuous effort underscores the sheer vitality of the mechanism we've just explored.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the anatomical basis of the upper limb.
It was a pleasure.
We hope you walk away better informed and ready for whatever challenge comes next. Keep digging deeper.